I wanted this gun and I do not know why, but I actually do. And we've never featured one on the channel before. Hi, Misha here. And today we're going to talk about the Heckler & Koch Volks pistol VP-70Z. The semi-automatic version of the VP-70M, which has a very interesting history. Now, a friend had this come into his shop, and I passed on these in the past, and this time I just could not help myself because it is a strange little pistol. So we're going to talk about that today and kind of some interesting features that it does have, believe it or not, and how this was kind of what HK was in the 60s. They weren't the Gucci gun maker back then. They were the very good, durable, economical, and simple gun maker. If you think about a G3, it's pretty simple, and that extends to the MP5. And this might have been one of their last attempts at a simplistic gun. In fact, that was kind of the whole point of its existence. So we're gonna dive in and then go to the range. Okay, starting off, by the way, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, Patreon always helps, especially in the YouTube environment today. This gun actually came in its original box, and kind of keeping with the simplistic thing, it's a simple box. And not much inside now. Paper and foam. But luckily, I did actually get a total of 3 mags with this. And the mags are one of its interesting features. Here's the one in it. These are 18 rounders, steel, double stack, but also double feed. And they're quite hard to get, and luckily it came with a total of 3. They also stand on their own. It's a very big base plate. So while I'm not really big to the box, or that doesn't matter to me, or manuals, it is always nice to have spare mags. Because like most HK mags, they're pretty hard to find. And of course it's a heel mag release. I guess we call it European style. It's a little stiff, you kind of got to angle it in, but it's not too bad. So let's talk about some of the features. Very simple gun. Not extremely heavy because we have a polymer frame, although it does have steel reinforcements, and we have what is essentially a stamped and welded slide with a block in. The rear sight, very standard. We have a top rib, and then the front sight is an interesting staple shape that kind of gives a false blank space there. Nothing under the barrel because this is way before rails. We have a cross bolt safety. This would only be on the 70Z. The 70M did not, because the trigger is the safety for the military gun. This is a true double action only, or as they marketed back then, revolver, double action revolver styles trigger, because it's in no way cocked when you charge the slide. Doesn't change. Now, this is a very simple gun. This spring is very stiff because it is a true blowback. Before I get there though, I want to mention that this grip is kind of chunky and weird as the pistol looks. This grip is actually quite slim for this size of a magazine in it that day. And I really like this kind of cutout here. It really fits the hand quite well, guys. There's no slide release because there's no hold open. There's no real sight adjustments. And this assembly is quite simple. Pull that down and the slide comes off. Now, interestingly, when that's down, your trigger is locked. Kind of neat. You don't need to remove the mag, but I always like to, just so we don't skin it up. And then it just comes apart like any other little blowback gun. Just instead of being in 32 or 380, it's a 9x19 parabellum spring. The spring is not either, well, I guess it is. I thought it would only go one way because one time it went, but yeah, it goes on the barrel. And this is your striker system back here. Simple. I think HK marketed it. This only has about 6 moving parts. Relatively light for what it is. And we have our slide here. Metal, but yeah. Firing pins up here. And you notice in the back here, there is that. You can actually use the magazine and rotate it to take it apart. If I do it right. No, maybe. Let's goof it up on camera. You can tell I've never really done this before. There we go. Get it back the right way. Try not to goof it. But that's how you take it apart. Let me fix this and we'll come right back. There, now I just hit my hand. Never mind. You can learn with me. Like I said, I've never really owned one of these before. But I did know that was supposed to go there. Probably a regular screwdriver would be easier. But the idea of being a, you know, ad hoc gun, your tools are built in. See, it kind of rotates out and you can take your striker and spring out. I think that's kind of cool. It kind of lives up to its idea of being what could have been the West German version of a Liberator pistol if the war ever happened. If I can get it on here, guys. There we go. Just fighting a stiff spring. Pop that back in. Good to go. It's clunky, but in a weirdly charming way. All right, we'll move on. That was the first time I ever tried using the base plate to disassemble it. And what was throwing me off is when you start to rotate it, it gets higgledy-piggledy. And it looks like it's unscrewing improperly, but actually that's correct because of the shape of the thing. Hard to explain, but if you've held one, I think you know what I mean. Also hard to finish this on camera, but we'll see. Wish J-Bro were still here. But it does fit in pretty good, and you just rotate or continue to rotate it, or I think it might need to go the other direction. At least mine prefers to. There we go. For whatever reason, mine seems to do better rotating to the right, but it's neither here nor there. And then from that point, you can just shake this out, hopefully. Maybe. There we go. And it's kind of a neat setup. This is our inside. So this is what I mean about it being asymmetric. On this end, it is, but this side is, you know, to fit the back of the slide. I didn't think about that on the video. So that's what was throwing me off. So this is a striker with a captive, or at least, yeah, it looks to be a captive spring on it. That's very nice. And then we have a firing pin or striker. I guess you call this a striker guide if we were talking Namboos. Actually, the whole system kind of reminds me of a Namboo, especially this tail on the firing pin. And then it has a rebounding spring here as a, you know, ad hoc firing pin safety to push the firing pin back. It's actually quite a light spring because these would have been expected to shoot a very wide range of ammunition. Which actually gets us to another one of this gun's interesting features. General specs, just because. This has a 4.6-inch barrel, meaning it's right in the service size, definitely not a compact, but for its day and time, a lot of pistols would even push that to 5 inches, so, you know, it's kind of in between, 4 being a compact length. Overall length is right around 8 inches. There and again, not especially small or large. And the weight, considering the capacity and size, isn't too bad at just a hair under 29 ounces unloaded. It has a safety that's on the Z model, and a smooth grip, which is unique to the Z model. And, of course, aside from the takedown we've already talked about, that's about it. Besides the true double action trigger, if you couldn't tell, every time you pull it, you're fully pulling it. And, of course, that heel-mounted mag release. And relatively large, deep serrations in the back, I will point out. But, of course, this is the 70s, not in the front. Nor is there a rail, of course. So, as we've already talked about, this is a simple blowback gun. Stamped steel and welded slide, but made beefy, and very much a spring system that is reminiscent of any blowback 32. How does it fire standard 9x19 parabellum, or for that matter, any other similar ammunition loading? This is something that's been talked about. I'm going to point it at you, but I left it disassembled so you know there's nothing, there. This has a very high quality HK barrel, but it has channels or flutes that actually let the powder and gas and pressure escape around and even out front of the bullet itself. So not all the energy goes behind it. And this allows it to be a blowback gun. Also allows it to be very flexible on the type of ammunition it fires. I wouldn't do it with mine. You definitely should not do it. But it kind of makes me wonder if it could even fire things like 9x17 Kurtz 380 or even 9x18 Makarov, even though that's actually a 9.2mm cartridge. That sounds like a test for someone like Demolition Ranch to do. Not us, not you. But very flexible, very simple. And the downside, well, there's two. One, of course, more felt recoil. Anyone who's ever fired a lot of little 380s will notice they actually feel snappier than a lot of 9x19s. That's because most 9x19s have a locking system of some type, whereas the 380 is just blowback like this gun. Another, it does reduce the energy of the projectile by about 150, 200. So it's not quite as low as, say, 380, but it does kind of turn 9x19 parabellum into almost like Makarov or something. But again, this was not meant to be a standard service gun, yada yada yada. This was a Liberator type gun, a Left Behind type gun. So the idea was basically it was not to see heavy use, but would be very critical. So it needed to work when it would work at least a few times, which explains pretty much all the decisions around this gun. The VP-70, either M or Z models, are by design and intent cheap and very conventional in a lot of ways, except for maybe one: the magazine. This is a very advanced mag for its day and time. Let's compare it with other quote-unquote high-capacity mags before. Here's kind of a brief history of double-stack mags and standard pistols. And we can see the evolution. We have the Savage here, over here. This is the 1907 model. And it was one of the highest capacity guns with a removable mag of the day. Now the broom handle Mauser, as it were, had a 10-shot mag, but it was internal. They wanted to do that in a removable mag. So we have it here. It is double stack. And look how simple the follower and feed are. Notice it's right in the middle, double stack, single feed. Quite small because this is 32 caliber, 7.65. Ironically, this is not a true blowback gun because it has a rotating barrel. It didn't need it, really, for 32, but back then they didn't know. So that was kind of the first iteration. Moving on with Browning here, we have the high power. All kinds of iterations. I just happened to bring out the Argentine one. This uses a locked breech system, very similar to other 9mm. This is what makes the VP-70 unique, that it doesn't have something we see today. It was the first to have this style of mag, originally 13 shots, double stack, single feed, with a more, angled and molded follower. And in a lot of ways, this still influences mag design to this day. And for a long time, this was the highest capacity 9mm pistol, until this gun came along. The French MAB PA-15 or P-15. This was the first to go to 15 rounds, using a similar style of mag, just bigger, frankly. And it was only a couple of years after this came out that this mag came out. I'm going to stick the one, there we go. And this holds 18 rounds. And it's a double feed. Not only can this be more reliable, it's also much easier to load. And if you notice, even though it holds 3 more rounds, it's not much bigger, at least lengthwise. Kind of interesting to see. Doot and doot. It also has viewing slits for the cartridges. And if you notice, it has a bulge down here and then a taper up here. This is a very small thing, but it kind of addresses another issue that was present at the time. If you go to a double stack mag, you're going to get a wider grip. Now this isn't really noticeable on the Savage because of the caliber and its size. On the high power, it gives a nice beefy grip, but it is thicker, chunkier than say on a 1911. And then of course you get to the French gun, and this is one massive grip, especially where it comes up into the receiver, the barrel. With the VP-70 though, while it starts off quite wide, it actually slims up quite a bit here, making it very comfortable. Now part of this is of course the fact that this is a polymer frame, so kind of bleeding into one of the other advanced parts, letting it be slim. But another part is the fact that the mag itself ever so slightly tapers in on the sides, letting it slide in. It also kind of acts as a mag stop. It's just a smart idea. The flare out there serves a few purposes and just adds to reliable feeding and what have you, kind of with that tapering system as the cartridges come up. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I find it kind of cool. And mentioning the polymer frame, of course, the VP-70 was quite the interesting anomaly on the market for over a decade, until of course this gun came along, the Austrian Glock 17. Yeah, I know it's known as the P80 for 1980, but realistically, it didn't go into production until 82, 83, even later, full production. And they really didn't start appearing in America till 1986, even 87. Yeah, I know technically 85, but it takes time. And of course, this took the whole polymer to the next level and used a Browning style locking system like the high power, just updated. What's interesting though, this is a heavier gun because of the slide, but really size wise they're very comparable. The VP-70 is a little bit longer, just a smidgen, than a full-size Glock, but height they're about the same. And of course the Glock is 17 plus 1, this is 18 plus 1, so practically the same. There's definitely some influence here. I'm not saying that Gaston Glock didn't really push this forward, because this was designed as a true service gun. This was designed as a last-ditch and or Liberator type gun, or to be used in films like Aliens by that point. I just kind of find the whole thing, the whole connection, very interesting. Would we have had a Glock without the VP-70? I don't know. Do you? Alright, enough drawing. Let's shoot this. And it's kind of becoming a bit of a channel thing now for me to not let Fox look at something until we're about ready to shoot it. So let's let him crack open the case while we record, get his take, and then we'll run a couple of mags through it. So, surprise for Fox, I never let him see it before he opened the box.
Is this like it looks like it belongs in the ocean. It looks like a little tuna fish.
So it's,
whoa. Man, guys.
It's Kanye West.
Is this Yeezy? This looks like a pair of Yeezys, folks. Slip them in.
How do you like that trigger?
That trigger is very unique.
That's a word for it.
I feel like you're using a cigar cutter. Look at that.
I went with staple gun, but yeah.
Yeah, cigar cutter, staple gun. Man, is this like the first polymer lower gun ever invented?
Yes.
Okay, well,
literally,
it shows
yes.
it. Well, keep in mind, I will gotta say it's HK quality. The slide on it is all but.
It's well machined.
I don't know what to say about this thing. I really don't.
It's been
anything,
50 years and no one does.
It looks like it belongs in Australia. You could maybe use it as a boomerang. Can I throw it?
If you buy it.
Let's do a torture test.
Let's not.
So, is this a 9mm?
Yeah.
This is going to be interesting to shoot.
It will be. Let's do it.
Misha's shots with the VP-70Z tuna fish.
VP-70Z.
Hey, it didn't hold open.
It's not supposed to.
I know.
Now it's Fox's turn.
This reminds me of like a Nintendo NES.
Duck hunt.
Duck hunt. Going hot.
Don't shoot the dog.
Okay. Whoa, wow, that trigger pull is... Wow.
Bump fire it.
Do what?
I said bump fire it.
I may not have a wrist left. It was like shooting a 50 cal. It held open.
Something. So you would think, based on that, the trigger, the kind of snappiness, the fact that it's a blowback 9mm, it would be completely unpleasurable to shoot. Yeah, you wouldn't be wrong. At the same time, Fox asked if I could bring it out again next time. There's something bizarrely fun about shooting this gun. Maybe it's the firearms equivalent of eating a really hot pepper in front of your friends. I don't know. But even though we only had limited time that day to shoot it because of family events and obligations, I at least wanted to make sure it worked and get Fox's first impression. But it sounds like this will be something I'll be throwing in the rig next time, or at least very soon again. As I said at the beginning of the video, I wanted this gun. Is it for the construction or how fun it is to shoot or accuracy? Really, no, of course not. It's for its place in history, because it really was important in a lot of ways for both HK and frankly the world at large. And once you really kind of grasp not only the historical context of what came before and what came after, but also its initial purpose, reason for being, it is so very cool in a 70s disco Cold War kind of way. So with that, let's go way back to World War I, where this gun's roots, the deepest roots at least, lie. As Fox and friends pointed out, this doesn't at first look like an HK, although the quality, you start to feel it when you pick it up, even if it's simplistic. But that's okay, because that's what early HKs were, simplistic. But High Point was thrown around. But when you put it in the context of history, it makes sense. Now, the Heckler & Koch company, Heckler & Koch GmbH, was founded in 1949. Well, the original company was 1948, but I digress, in West Germany. And it was by, well, Heckler & Koch, yes, those two individuals. Also, Alex Seidel. I'm not sure why he didn't get a thing in there. Maybe HKS didn't work for him. Technically, he was the youngest partner. Anyway, all three at various times had worked at Mauser in Oberndorf. Alex Seidel, for example, started working there around 1932. And back then, Mauser's pistol was the model 1914, which we've done videos on. Interesting gun, striker fired, 32. There were other calibers, but that was the primary one. It's a service gun. And it would be replaced by the model 1934, which was essentially the same gun, just with a few upgrades. But Seidel would work on the project that would result in the Mauser HSC here. And in some ways, it's similar to the previous models. In other ways, very different. It is a hammer-fired gun. Very recessed. Kind of reminds me of those revolvers with recessed hammers. Double single action. Very well, nicely made gun. And these sold very well. They sold over 300,000. Originally, it was actually designed for the consumer market by Mauser. But, of course, it was quickly co-opted by the Nazis. And production would continue immediately after the war in France, who had occupied the factory in Oberndorf. It was in their zone. That's why I wanted to bring this out. This is a P-38 built under French occupation, but it actually shows kind of the direction that Mauser was taking. The P-38 was quite an advanced gun for its day and time, but of course it was developed by Walther. But Mauser really pushed the design forward, going to more stamped parts like the slide release. To be fair, there were some sheet steel parts like the top cover from the very beginning at Walther, but they also went to these pressed steel grips at Mauser. They actually developed them at the end of World War II as a cheap thing, but they never really went into production before the war was over. But nevertheless, they existed. They also pioneered the use of so-called phosphate, what we think of as parkerized finishing. Cheaper, but in some ways a lot better. And everyone knows the MP44, which was created with stamped steel and sheet steel. But Mauser had worked on the STG-45M, which was an even cheaper and easier to produce while still high quality gun. I'm getting somewhere with this. I think maybe you start to see it. Mauser were all three founders of HK who had worked at various times, including Seidel during World War II, pioneered the use of new manufacturing techniques that were better to produce, but in some ways more durable, if not necessarily as attractive. They pushed the P-38 design forward, and they had some interesting projects at the end of the war. And I think you see that with H&K. But of course, early on, they weren't selling, even manufacturing or designing guns. They were established as an engineering firm, but they mostly made components for civilian life in, at the time, West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. Sewing machines, bicycles, maybe some parts for cars, that kind of thing, because they were rebuilding after the war. But this would all change in 1955 when West Germany was integrated into NATO, the military was allowed to reorganize, and the new army, the Bundeswehr, was founded, and of course it needed equipment. Moving into the Cold War era, as is famously known, in 1956, West Germany adopted the G1, which was an FAL variant, but they really started work on their own rifle. And HK would submit a Spanish design modified to German needs as the G3, and it would eventually win out, being adopted in 1959. This was HK's as a company, or HN%K, Heckler and Koch, because they were not cool enough to drop the ampersand or even abbreviate back then, yet. They would submit the G3, and it would win and be the Bundeswehr's new rifle. Now, their new pistol wasn't so new. It was the P1, Pistol 1, from Walther, which, if this looks like that P38 we just looked at, it is. It's just an updated P38. With one big change, we have an alloy frame, something that Walther pioneered in World War II, but didn't really get successful. So the lightweight, but still durable military frame was in German mindset long before this polymer frame of the VP-70. Now, when you go to East Germany, they would also rearm under the Soviet watchful eye, and their standard gun was the Makarov, 9mm, but 9x18. This is a simple blowback gun, all steel. Relatively decent trigger pull on this one for being East German, but this was as powerful as they could really get a simple blowback gun. There were some benefits to that. Frankly, blowback guns can be more reliable. They're also much cheaper to produce, easier to maintain. A gun like this, firing 9x19, uses a locked breech, and as you know, there were problems with the frames and other things cracking on these, so that's why they were updated over time. The Makarov, well, it just kind of works. So the idea of getting as much power out of a blowback as possible wasn't a new one when HK went to this. And things after the success of the G3, which was originally government-owned and produced by Rheinmetall as well, eventually HK would end up with full rights, but this wouldn't be until 1977. But in 1964-65, they had a new idea. The G3 and SETME were based on that STG-45M. There's reasons we've talked about it, other people have, you get it. But they decided to turn the roller-delayed gun into a family, HK-33, and of course the HK-54 appeared in 1966, coming onto the market in 1969 as the MP5. Now, I would have grabbed my SP5, but with everything going on currently, it's not in a state where I can show it in a video. So the Pakistani one that I decided to make into a carbine, the POF, hey, that doesn't seem like such a stupid decision right now, does it? People kind of wondered why, but at least it's one I can show you on camera at the moment. But I brought it out because of three things, really. First, this shows the continued use of stamped heavy gauge, military gauge steel that's welded together, which is what forms the VP-70's slide. So the same kind of tech is here, but advanced. Another thing, the polymer. The original G3, like the SETME, really only had polymer on the pistol grip, plastic, whatever. But soon the G3A3 and G3A4 would be introduced, and the MP5 from the get-go had polymer handguard and buttstock, and of course in the 70s we'd start to see the wide style, but it shows them using for furniture. And I can understand why. If polymer works for this pistol grip, why not for this pistol grip? I think I kind of see a thing here. And I want to point out that the G3 was kind of seen as a more affordable, more economical alternative to the FAL and other guns. HK, while making high-quality guns from always, were trying to make them on a somewhat of a budget. And the MP5, while a high-quality gun, was not expensive as such back then. So that kind of explains the area here. There's also one more thing where you can see some connection here, specifically with these early mags. Yeah, and their design. This is the original straight mag for the MP5. Double stack, but also double feed. MP5s are known for being much easier to load than other SMG mags, especially the curve type. But looking at this tech here, there's a clear connection here, especially with the double feed. I think one really informs the other. Now, eventually a 15-round mag would also get released for the MP5, which is a little smaller than this, but I don't know. You can definitely tell these two mags came from the same kind of design lineage. And that's all from the G3 HK33, or in this case, MP5. So I've kind of set the stage for the technology and what's going on for the VP-70. So why was this created? It was not for the Bundeswehr. Not as such. They use the P1 and the G3 as their standard issue. But this was designed for a very different purpose. VP, Volks pistol, stands for People's Pistol, and 70 is the year of first introduction, 1970. Alex Seidel, we talked about, was the primary engineer designer on this project, but of course other people had a hand in it too. The notion here was to develop a new Liberator pistol. Liberator was a really interesting, cheaply made gun in World War II that could be produced in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands for pennies, and just airdropped behind enemy lines to arm partisans, insurgents, freedom fighters, the French, the Polish, our allies behind the lines. It fired 45. It was made of stamped, or rather sheet steel, truly. It basically had a tube for a barrel. It was a single shot, and basically you would shoot a Nazi with it and then take his gun. So that's what they were kind of working with in the late 60s at Heckler & Koch, was an updated, modernized Liberator pistol. Something cheap, dependable, reliable, that they could make in their hundreds of thousands. And the idea was, if the Russians, if the Soviet, if the Warsaw Pact ever came through the Fulda Gap, these would be left behind or airdropped in behind the lines or smuggled in to arm resistance. So part of it was, okay, you could use it to shoot a Russian and take his gun. Another part was they wanted it to be a little more capable. And so it was also designed as kind of an assassination tool. So a little more than that, but it still kind of explains things. Well, most things. This was a whole contingency plan that NATO had. West Germany was part of it, but it was kind of spearheaded by the CIA. It was known as Operation Gladio, and it's a really good thing it never happened, because it would have happened probably in the shadow of nuclear mushroom clouds. Kind of a doomsday gun in a sense. But you really see HK putting its know-how to work to make a cheap but effective gun here. And where they kind of got their inspiration from the stamped type slide, polymer frame, double stack, double feed mag, even the direct blowback. The whole Makarov thing. They found a way to make 9x19 work. There was also another thing, kind of a secondary thing I just thought I'd grab here real quick. Because of terrorist activity, red insurgent type stuff, West Germany's police armed with 32s were kind of outclassed by the 70s. So guns like this came around. This is the Walther PP Super. It fires 9x18 Ultra, or a 9x18 Police. This was yet again an attempt to make a blowback gun as powerful as possible while still being a blowback. And while HK didn't, there was some work there, but mostly that was Mauser. They actually did a version of the HSC, which had gone back into production. But yeah, I just thought I'd bring this Walther out because this is a blowback gun. And in fact, this in itself is kind of based on the HSC still, at least to some part. The striker system is kind of a little bit reminiscent of the 1914. And while HK was a different company, people had experience there. So their first pistol wasn't actually released until 1967 when they're kind of growing. It's the HK4, which in a lot of ways is like an advanced, evolved HSC. And they did reasonably well with them. They sold some to German border guards, what have you. So this was actually an early pistol for HK, released in 1970. It went into actual production in 1973, or at least the VP-70M version did. But this is the VP-70Z. So let's talk about the differences. So obviously I don't have a Volks People's 70 Militar VP-70M to show you. For one thing, not that many were actually made. And it only seems like they were produced in the 70s, and they built about 3,200 between about 73 and I really don't know the kind of end date, but it seems to be 75, 78, somewhere in that time frame. Because this was very easy to mass produce once you got the tech down, once you got the line up. And HK didn't even really try that hard to market these to the Bundeswehr. They didn't really have a need. Heck, they didn't even really adopt the MP5. They used the MP2, which was an Uzi. But they did market it abroad. Now, the M model pistol on the top is very similar. The biggest difference, it has finger groove grips like you see in a lot of MP5 and HK style grips, so finger grooves. It also doesn't have this cross bolt safety. It wanted to just rely on this extremely wonderful trigger. It's about 15 pounds, but what I will say for it, even though it's heavy and long, it's not horrible. It's not crunchy or rough, and it is consistent, and you can kind of stage it. There's like an initial small take up, then a longer one, and then you can pull it back here, and then finally pull it through. So it's a 3-stage trigger, but that's because you're doing all the cocking action for the striker back here. So take it as you will. Safety on, but not for the military gun. And of course, the big feature that everyone knows about, the military gun could accept a polymer shoulder stock, harkening back to the broom handle Mauser and the high power. And when it was attached, it gave you the option to go from single shot to 3-round burst. Not full auto, but 3-round burst, because the cyclic rate was well over 2,000 rounds, at least with most ammo types, because it's just a blowback gun. So even this 18-round mag would be gone in no time. As it was with 3-round burst, 18-round mag gave you essentially 6 shots. Enough for either a quick assassination mission or to definitely take a guard's weapon. Although, to be fair, if you had a Makarov, even though I love Makarovs, J-Ro, not so much. Are you really upgrading? Let's just hope he has a Kalashnikov, right? Or something similar. But that was the select fire version, removable shoulder stock that could double as a holster. It also had kind of a rig sling thing. I'd love to have one, but obviously they don't really exist. Fun fact, after 1968, you could no longer import select fire anything, or even Title 3, Class 3 anything for the civilian market. This met with, pretty limited success, which is probably a good thing. The only time it might have been called upon is if World War III were declared. So I'm kind of glad the VP-70M was never needed for mass production. But it was classed as a machine pistol, MP, and kind of sits alongside other compact PDWs for the era, like, say, the VZ61 Scorpion. But this is the VP-70Z. Very similar to the M. Again, straight grip throw. We do have a cross bolt. There's actually a reason for that we'll get to in just a second. Luckily, we have the same capacity, same type of magazine, so they didn't neuter it there. And no ability to take the shoulder stock apparatus, at least not most. I don't know exactly when production began, but it seems to have been at the end of the Select Fire M run. So, I don't know, 75, 78, somewhere along that time period. And these were built up all the way through 1989. True, they were targeted for the civilian market, but also the police market. And, you know, we kind of laugh at this pistol today, but let's think. Late 70s, early 80s, you know, it wasn't as kooky. This polymer frame is light and comfortable. It is well made. It's not a super big gun. The capacity is amazing for that day and time. And even this trigger, it's not all bad. It is smooth. It is consistent. The HK marketed it as a revolver trigger. And they had a point. Because at that time, in the 1970s, most police departments were using revolvers still. And they were mostly double action. A relatively long, smooth, but heavy pull. Of course, you'd have single action as an option, which this does not. But that was kind of their play. And it gave the same benefits as a double action, namely safety. You have a system, a firing pin at rest. They put that extra spring in there so it could not accidentally set off a primer. And just to be extra safe, for police, they gave this cross bolt safety, which, as the somewhat similar P7 showed us, was probably a good thing. In fact, I see a lot of similarity with the P7, the old squeeze cocker, to this gun. And there were more than a few police that, using the front grip as a safety, they were accidents. So I kind of understand why HK put it here. Just relying on the trigger for police and civilian, probably not the best. Better safe than sorry. You don't have to use it. I don't mind it. It reminds me of like a Remington 870 safety. But yeah, when you think about this in terms of revolvers, it's probably going to be lighter or the same weight, about the same size. Trigger, if you're just talking double action. And most of these would fire 38, maybe 357, 9x19. Even if the rifling here reduces its oomph a little bit, it's still quite good. And of course, you get 18 plus 1 instead of 6 plus 1, or in the case of some small guns, 5 plus 1. So compared to other police guns, it makes sense. At least you can understand where HK was marketing it. And I can't imagine this cost them just a heck of a lot of R&D time and development. So they probably didn't actually need to make just a ton of these and a ton of money to come off successful. But they did actually build about 23,500, all pretty much like this one, although there was a run of 400 for the Italian market that could accept the shoulder stock, but didn't have the full auto components in either the stock or the gun. And those were in 9x21 IMI, which was a specific cartridge to comply with Italian civilian ownership law at the time. So the most of these 70Zs were in 9x19, but 400 give or take were in 9x21, and they could take a stock. So I'd love to have one. Then again, how often are you going to be able to find ammo to shoot with it, right? But I wanted to provide some context of why, from the point of view of the 70s, this was pretty advanced and had some pretty good selling points. Not to mention the price tag was not horrible. And it would lead to better things for HK and other gun makers. So let's end this part of history, kind of comparing it to guns that would come out in its immediate stead, at least for the military use. And I thought it would be good to begin with the Sig Sauer P220, or P75 for when it was adopted in 1975. Of course, this was a joint Swiss-West German project. Also a 9mm, of course, this is a locked breech gun. So you might not think at first there's much in common with the VP-70, And it's probably more or less a coincidence, but at least this gun showed that the concept of a stamped and welded slide with a pinned-in block in the back here would work. This would have been one of the first service guns with this technology. They also would use early computer design to create it and even manufacture it, which is something this gun often doesn't get kind of credit for. The fact that it was so ahead of its time in the way it was made. Of course, it still has a relatively low capacity mag and all that, but it would lead to the 226 and 228 and all that family, so I just thought it would be worth pointing it out. Similarly, from Beretta, the 92 series would come out in the late decade. I decided to pick the older version here. This is the S version with the heel release. You notice this has that European style release too. They're still kind of on about it, even at this point. But this is showing a greater, reliable, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Sorry, guys. A greater use. There we go. Wish I could edit sometimes, but oh well. You want to know me, flub and all. Of higher capacity mags. But this is still just a 15 plus 1, meaning this is still more. Also, this is still a heavier gun. True, as part of kind of the Wonder 9s that it would inspire. It is an alloy frame, not steel, so it's not as bulky as it could be, but it's not as necessarily slim like up here, and it's just not as light. And as we've seen, some of the early 92s had some maybe dependability things, and of course this is still a locked breech and full-size gun. But yeah, I just love the Beretta. They're just so cool when these surplus ones came out. So even here, when we're getting at the end of the 70s, compared to these two, and these started to come into the country through Browning, you could say, well, this has the biggest capacity, lightest weight. It's simple, it's easier to clean, and I can put up with the heavy trigger. You know, we were shooting them, and it's not something I want to run 1,000 rounds through in a day, but for like a defensive gun, a home defense gun, or even a police gun, hey, it's not bad. It's going to go boom every time you pull the trigger. So even at the late 70s, it still has some things to recommend it, which explains why they sold decently well through the 80s in the USA and to a lesser extent around the world. In the VP-70, both the M and also the Z would see some use by a few military special forces and police agencies. Portugal is probably the largest one in Europe that would go with it. In South America, Paraguay and Brazil would use them, at least agencies therein. And then you had a few places like Lebanon that would use them, and mostly by police, and they would appear here and there. So, you know, if you look at Wikipedia, take it for what you're worth, about a half dozen places had police agencies and or government special forces type things, or guards, what have you, that pick some of these up. So it's not without any service history, just, you know, limited. But that seems like HK was fine with it. It was more or less for the civilian and police markets, and honestly, almost a technology demonstrator. But of course, finally, in the 80s, one gun that would come along and pretty much finally make this look obsolete. Of course, we're back to the Glock. And this is really when someone produces, at least mass produces, something that is truly better. We have the affordability of production, modern manufacturing techniques for the slide. We have a true locked breech, which while the blowback was interesting, I think the drawbacks kind of outweigh the benefits. We had an even more advanced polymer frame. We now have polymer mags. True, these are 17 plus 1 Notice the taper kind of at the top, like, and there, of course, they're single feed, but still overall an improvement. Of course, you could get the longer ones. It's also worth pointing out that the Glock 18, in the 80s were kind of the time of the select fire pistol, and you have to wonder how much the VP-70M influenced the creation of the Glock 18. Anywho, this is when we finally go past it, which is actually a tribute to a gun first revealed to the world in 1970 and first sold in 1973. It took over a decade for it to really be surpassed. And the trigger is actually, if you think about it, very similar. But where Glock did something here, the HK is, of course, completely at rest. It's a true DAO double action. Every time you pull the trigger, you're charging it and letting it go. With the Glock, of course, it's that partially cocked system. Still not a great trigger, according to a lot of people. I frankly don't mind it. But, yeah. And, of course, once you pull the trigger until the slide goes, it's completely at rest. Fun fact, when these first started coming into the USA, customs and whatnot, where you had to fill out forms, didn't really know how to classify it. That's why these were classified as DAO guns in the beginning, because they really didn't have a place for this kind of partially cocked striker system. Also, of course, this is why there's the dingus on the trigger, kind of acting as the safety would have on the heavy pull here. So in a lot of ways, the firing system is very similar, just with one big crucial improvement. And also, if you think about it, at this time, it's the Germanic places, Germany, Austria, that are really pushing development forward. You look over what America's doing, it's not much in the gun, at least the handgun world, guys. Kind of resting on their laurels. Okay, yeah, Italy's advancing the 92 series, so giving them credit there. France is kind of stalled out because a lot of their companies are going out of business, like MAB. And I think Britain's long since given up the game. They never really got into semi-automatic manufacturing worth noting. So it really was kind of West Germany at the time, Austria, Italy, kind of that, the old Axis powers. And then, of course, you had some things in East Europe, like the CZ75 coming out. And I think that's why this gun seems cool to me. It's integral in that kind of awkward growing pains period. You get past the machined, finely crafted guns of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You get into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You're going to different techniques, different ways of manufacturing, and new technologies. And sometimes it's a hit, and sometimes it's a miss. But I will say, for the world's first production polymer frame service type pistol, this polymer is actually good quality. It's held up well over the years. And even if the trigger system is kind of horrendous, it's at least reliable. Better to be that than something else. And let's not forget that lots of other Wonder 9s from the 80s had their own problems too, including my own Walther, who made the P88. But at this point, this is the time of Glock. And to some extent Beretta. But before both, we had this. And so it's definitely worth considering. Also, it's an HK before they became Gucci prices. Well, once they dropped, they went from Heckler and Koch to H&K to HK. And every time they shortened their name, they lengthened their price. Ever notice that? So what do you think? Have I convinced you of this gun's validity? And if so, did you ever think someone could convince you that a VP-70 is worth anything? And if not, well, you were probably right all along either way. Let's wrap things up. Alrighty guys, well, I know there are plenty of other VP-70Z videos out there, but that's ours, and you got range time with me and Fox. It's interesting, and it has a place in history. And this is one of the HKs that is not expensive even to this day. This is in perfectly fine shape. It's nice that it had the extra mags, the box, The box doesn't really do much for me, but that's fine. It just seemed like something to add to the old collection. A few years ago, you could pick these up for 500 bucks, maybe 400 on a good day. Today, they're still not 1,000, but 6 or 7, but I think I'll hang on to this guy. I like blowback guns. I never could find a Walther Model 6, something I've always wanted, so this is kind of spiritually like it. And I like the early HK stuff, showing really where they got their roots. In fact, this grip, kind of the smooth grip, reminds me of kind of the Navy-style trigger grips you can find in, say, the MP5 or some of the HK33s. Anyone else own one of these? If so, what's your experience? Love to talk about it below. And I do think this double feed mag is pretty cool. Kind of belies that this was a cross between a pistol and a PDW, or even machine pistol, if you will. All right, well, appreciate you hanging out today. Kind of more low-key video. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, please check out the link over on Patreon. This is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.